Hello and welcome to my podcast. My name is Peter Doherty. I'm a Catholic priest and a psychologist who integrates my training in psychology and scripture studies to help understand the Gospels from a psychological perspective and seek out new pastoral teachings for Christians in these modern times. My podcasts are between 7 to 10 minutes in length, where I share insights and reflections that I hope will be useful to you. Please don't hesitate to contact me with questions or comments. Love to hear. Today's podcast is from the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verse 41 to 51. This Gospel will be read in churches August the 11th, 2024. The Gospel reminds me of an earlier Gospel of Jesus coming back to his hometown, and he is not welcomed because the people know his family. Regardless of the people's response, Jesus still teaches the people who are not willing to listen. Jesus is not put off and tries to teach them anyway. As I mentioned in an earlier podcast, John's Gospel is the last to be written. These Gospel readings sound more like a reflection on spirituality than an actual teaching. When examining John's Gospel, I find it helpful to ask, where or what are the questions that John's community were trying to answer? There seems to have been several questions. It appears that some members of the community were wondering if there were other ways to come to know God, other than through Jesus. Jesus is clear that he is the source of coming to know God. He doesn't actually say that there are other ways or that he is the only way. Jesus simply states that he is the way to know God and that through him we have a means to grow in our relationship with God. There are several possible reflections in this gospel. We have the theme of Jesus being the bread of life. This theme is well known. It has links to the story from Exodus, where the people were sustained and rescued from starvation while they were stranded in the desert. The story is a great metaphor of our God sustaining us in times of struggle and in turmoil. Bread was a stable food in the diet of the Israelites, as in many cultures. Bread in its many forms continues to be a major element of the world's diet, despite all the health concerns about gluten and processed wheat. During this time, food shortage was an issue. His metaphor of being the bread of life would have been a very powerful one to his early listeners. Jesus goes as far as to say that whoever eats the bread will never die. This reminds me of the story where Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well and talks about giving her living water, after which she will never thirst again. Please read the Gospel of John, chapter 4, verse 7 to 13, for more of this story. Jesus speaks of giving his flesh for the life of the world. It's quite a graphic image, and it's difficult to understand. I urge you to focus on the message rather than the culturally infused expression of the message. To gain insight, let us take a moment and reflect on the Jewish concept of sacrifice in order to gain a deeper insight into this gospel and the practice of making sacrifice. The act of sacrifice was meant to bring the worshiper closer to God, and the meat or flesh from these sacrifices were considered holy. The consumption of sacrificial meat was part of the sacrificial ritual, often culminating in a meal that symbolized a reunion or communion with God. This meal was festive, a conclusion to the sacrificial rite, reinforcing the bond between the worshiper and the divine. Eating the meat of sacrificed animals was practiced by both the Israelites and even people who worshipped idols. In the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 8, verse 1 to 9, Paul talks about a controversy arising from eating the meat of an animal sacrificed to idols. The Corinthians argue that there was no harm because they did not believe that other gods existed. Paul agreed with their reasoning, but appealed to their hearts so as not to scandalize anyone with an immature or undeveloped faith, who would be confused if they saw the Christians eating the meat sacrificed to idols and would wonder what it all meant. The examples here are very personal and intimate. Jesus is talking about infusing our life with God's life. You can't get any closer than that. I wonder if, on some level, people are sometimes nervous about this God who wants to be so close to us. It's sometimes easier to see God as a demanding judge with a set of extreme rules to follow, or a distant God in heaven who is not much involved in our lives. Most loving relationships do experience the ebb and flow of relationships. Relationships go through periods of intensity and periods of distance. People sometimes like being close, and other times they need their space. It's clear that God respects our space, but we can clearly see that God is the pursuer in this relationship. Some people may feel God is distant, not involved much in his creation. I agree that may be how we feel, but is it accurate? Just because God does not behave in the way we want or expect does not mean he's not present or caring. I urge you to spend some time reflecting on what God must do to get your attention. Jesus also redefines death when he says that those who eat this bread will not die, going as far as to say that they will live forever. This may seem strange to us, as people we know do die. Jesus proposes that while there is physical death, the spirit can live forever. One can see this teaching would not be easy to fully understand. We ought not to seek out death, but on the other hand, not be afraid of our death. I still encourage people to live their life to the fullest. I'm planning on releasing a podcast devoted to the theme of Christian death in Advent. Stay tuned. Thank you for listening. I invite you to join me next week when I examine the Gospel of John, continuing with the teachings and theme of Jesus feeding believers with his own body. If this is the first time you've heard my podcast and you're interested in hearing more, I urge you to listen to my podcasts listed on the website. Every Sunday, I release a new podcast focusing on the gospel for the following week. I invite you to listen to all the podcasts, and I hope the reflections are useful to you. The podcast, A Psychologist Looks at Scripture, is found on most of the platforms that carry podcasts. The podcast is also available on YouTube. Please do not hesitate to leave a review or subscribe. Feedback from my listeners can be helpful in the further development of this podcast. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank my team, Heather Patel-Doherty and Richard Coulon, who play an important part in the preparation of this gospel. If you have any questions or concerns or want to reach me directly, I can be reached by email at peter.doherty, O-M-I, that is DOHERTYOMI, @gmail.com. Have a great week, and God bless you.